What is up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Going to do things a little bit different this week. Before I explain that, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss all of the content I put out on YouTube every single week. I'm going to spend the first part of the show doing a state of the Premier League Big Six, is what I'm calling it. Going through all six clubs and figuring out kind of where they're at, giving some thoughts, really diving deep into just the status of these big six clubs. They're all in kind of interesting places right now, and I thought this would be a good time with kind of a quieter week to really discuss that. And then with the Bundesliga starting back up this weekend, I'm going to go around the rest of Europe's top five leagues and talk about some of the bigger developments there and kind of set the stage for the second half of the season. So let's jump in. Premier League Big Six clubs starting. We're going in reverse order of the table, so starting with Chelsea. I did talk about Chelsea last week with the Premier League Panic Meter, so I'm not going to go over all of that. The big development here since then is the signing of Mikhailo Mudryk. Of course, it sounded forever like this was going to be an Arsenal move. It sounded, Mudryk was watching Arsenal games, praising Mikel Arteta, all of that stuff, and he ends up at Chelsea. There are a lot of questions that come with this. First, it's the question I ask every time Chelsea signs somebody, is that player actually going to solve the problem? Because the problem is a lack of consistent finishers, and even more than that, the problem is chance creation. Can you get something out of anybody not called your wingbacks? Can you survive offensively when your wingbacks are injured like they are right now? Can somebody fix this attack? Because of all the money that's been spent, it is nowhere near where it should be. And that was Thomas Tuchel's problem, and Graham Potter hasn't exactly fixed it. I still hold out faith that Graham Potter can. If there is anybody capable of doing so in a pretty quick amount of time, I believe it's Graham Potter. I've lost zero faith whatsoever in him. But the problem still exists. Maybe Mudryk is that guy. He just becomes this elite finisher in the Premier League, and at least he unlocks some things, gives Chelsea a little bit different dimension to the attack, and maybe he really does go a long way to solving these issues. It is possible. My second question. With all of the money that was spent on this move, what is the chance that Chelsea actually get their money's worth out of this? What was the motivation for making this specific move right now? Because the calculation is completely different for Chelsea signing Mudryk than it is for Arsenal. We'll get to Arsenal at the end, obviously, as they're at the top of the table. If you're Arsenal and you look at that price tag, you say, you know what? It's more than we want to pay. It's probably more than we should pay. But we're winning the Premier League. Manchester City is the team on our heels. Sometimes you just got to do it. And spend more than you want to take advantage of this opportunity, because if that extra 30 million or whatever it might be is the difference between you winning the Premier League and losing the Premier League, you make that sacrifice every single day of the week, of course. So you're weighing something completely differently if you're Arsenal. From Chelsea's perspective, what are you trying to accomplish this season? Top four at this point, I would think. I don't see one signing being the difference between this team in 10th or finishing top four. If Chelsea's going to finish top four, it's going to be because they get healthy, because they start getting goals, because their defense holds up, and you get Wesley Fofana back, and you get your wingbacks back, and you get your midfield healthy, all that stuff. I don't see Mikhailo Mudryk, as good as he is, tipping the scales. And so it fits the description of a panic buy. I just don't even know if that's the accurate way to articulate what this is, though. Because the panic buy is something really bad would happen if we don't make this move, right? That just don't care what the money is, we got to do this. But that implies that the panic buy is the solution to the problem. And that's where there are so many things that have gone wrong for Chelsea, from injuries to tactics, that it's too big for one signing to solve. So I don't even really want to call it a panic buy. But that's the idea behind it. And the other thing I want to point out here is, and kind of the other question, is Todd Boehly any different than Roman Abramovich? Because it came in with this, long-term plan, sticking with Graham Potter, this vision for the future, and all we've seen is spend, 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 spend. Graham Potter hasn't been fired yet. That is potentially a change, assuming he, is able to stick around long term. But this is just trying to plug holes by spending more money, which is what Chelsea have always done. And again, it's too early to totally determine that, but the approach has not been any different under Todd Boehly so far. And so when you go see this kind of money spent on Mikhailo Mudryk, it's just another indication that this isn't any different. It's not definitive proof, because nothing can be definitive proof this early, but it's another point in the column of Chelsea are just continuing to be the same old Chelsea, it's just a different owner. And the final thing I'll get to here is what you are seeing consistently is that you cannot outspend your problems when other teams at your level are actually operating well and hitting on their signings and developing talent and have a coach who's improving players. And right now, clearly Arsenal are doing that. Manchester City are always going to do that, and they're always going to have more money than you if you're Chelsea. Newcastle have now entered into that equation. Manchester United, we'll get to them later, all on board with that. That's 4. And I still have a lot of faith in Liverpool. They're up next. So that's 4 to 5 clubs, depending on how you're feeling, who are functioning quite well right now, even if this season isn't going particularly well for Liverpool. Ask Tottenham how that philosophy is working for them. If you don't actually fix the internal issues, and ask Manchester United for a long time how that was working for them. If you don't fix the issues, you are not just going to be able to turn into the club you want to be and go contend for a Premier League title again and win another Champions League. Maybe you can win a Champions League with one of those bizarre runs that Chelsea have now had a couple of in the Champions League. But to be where you want to be season in, season out in the Premier League, you got to fix the actual internal issues. You can't just spend your way out of it. As I mentioned, second on our list, Liverpool. A very bizarre, mid-table clash this weekend between Liverpool and Chelsea. This is where I will admit I was wrong, at least to an extent, on Liverpool. I am very stubborn in my Jurgen Klopp belief, and it has come back to bite me. This is going to be much more difficult than I thought for Liverpool to get back to being a top, 2-3 team in the world like they've been for most of the past 5 or so seasons. The main reason for that, and my biggest concern, is that this group of players has reached its peak, not because from an part of it is the age profile at this point. But when I say group of players, I also mean the new faces that are coming in. This era of Liverpool, not just the original group that got to those Champions League finals that won the Premier League, from Gini Wijnaldum to Darwin Núñez. I'm including everything. I don't think it's possible in the short, next 2-3 years for Liverpool to get back to being a, 90 to 100 point team in the Premier League, because Virgil van Dijk simply isn't the same player. And it's not just that you can't replace that Virgil van Dijk because that player doesn't exist. There was one Virgil van Dijk at his best. It's also because their entire system of play was predicated on having that guy to clean up messes, to cover space, to sniff out attacks, to let Andy Robertson and Trent Alexander-Arnold do what they do best without having to really emphasize their weakness in their defending. And now, what are you seeing? More of Robertson and specifically Alexander-Arnold getting exposed, less control in the midfield. Van Dijk is still a very good player. He's just not the same. You're seeing a mistake here or there from him. And now this just doesn't look like the same kind of Liverpool team, because it isn't. Now, that being said, I am still convinced, and I'm very confident, this is a retool, not a rebuild. Not just because Jurgen Klopp's there, but because as bad as things have gone this season and as poor, as awful as that Brighton game was, and they got past Wolves in the FA Cup replay, it wasn't much better. How different does this look if, let's just say, Jude Bellingham enters the equation this summer? You've got a midfield spot that's taken care of. You have a player who fits perfectly into the kind of system you want to play. So now you're talking about some combination of, Naby Keita, Thiago, and Jude Bellingham, let's just say. Does it solve all of the midfield issues? No, but it looks an awful lot better. And then on top of that, you still have Alexander-Arnold, Andy Robertson, a nice set of center back options relative to the rest of the world, not relative to what you had 3 years ago in, again, elite Virgil van Dijk. And then an attack. Salah, Nunez, Diaz, Cody Gakpo, Diogo Jota, Roberto Firmino is having a really good season. It's not like this team is falling apart. There are some holes that need to be plugged, and it's all about what the expectations are. If you're comparing Liverpool to, some of the better teams in Premier League history, and the Liverpool team that was right up there with the best in the history of the Premier League in terms of the points that they put on the board to win that Premier League title, yeah, it's going to be disappointing. But Liverpool is kind of weird in that sense because they sort of went from not being where they should be to being right there with Manchester City. There was no, and of course, there have been a few ups and downs. The one season where Alisson scored to kind of get him into the Premier League, into the Champions League. But generally speaking, there haven't been a lot of, third, fourth place finishes where they're just really good, not great, not the best team in the league, not going toe-to-toe with City. They're just a very solid, confident third. That hasn't really happened. So you might just see that. That doesn't mean it's a rebuild. There's some work that needs to be done. The midfield needs to have some kind of overhaul. The other name I'll throw out there is Declan Rice. Not the same player as Bellingham, but if they can go get somebody like that this summer, I really do think we're having a different conversation about Liverpool next season. It's not like you can say they waited too long to overhaul and start refreshing the squad. But once they started doing it, they have been fully committed to the task. It's just maybe not been in the order that it should be or needs to be if you're trying to maintain your standard and what Liverpool have come to be over these past handful of seasons. Because there was an awful lot invested in the attack, and all those guys can't get on the field together. But I'm still sticking with Klopp. I'm just tampering my expectations a little bit. And, the team that was only a matter of months ago fighting for a quadruple on 4 fronts and played, 60 games last season? Maybe they're just a little bit tired. And then had a World Cup thrown in where most of their players, I know Salah wasn't there, but most of their players also participated in that. Maybe they're just a little tired and not at their best this season. That's part of this too. Up next is Tottenham. I've also kind of harped on some of these themes with Spurs in terms of you're just asking for trouble by continually not showing up in the first half, especially with a team that has mistakes in them, whether it's the center backs, whether it's Hugo Lloris. They do need to get healthy. The Rodrigo Bentancur injury, the injuries to the front line at times is certainly part of the story here. None of it is an excuse based on the talent this team has. I fall in love with this squad year after year after year after what they do in the summer transfer window. And I've gotten to the point where I feel like I've learned my lesson and I am going to be skeptical until Spurs prove they can actually get the most out of this group of players, whatever group of players that is. And now you're getting to a very interesting conversation, both with Antonio Conte and with Harry Kane. Because if this is going all in, and if you're Daniel Levy, you certainly have to believe it is with the amount of money you spent. It is not like Antonio Conte has no money to work with, that he's not getting the backing he needs. Look at the amount of investment that's been made and the amount of new players who have come in. Richarlison, Bentancur, Kulusevski. I know those two were kind of strange in at the beginning of Conte, but both have been sensational for Spurs. Perisic, you go down the list. You can't continue to spend all of that money and continue to back Antonio Conte that way if what it's getting you is another disappointing season where you're in a perfect world finding a way to qualify for the Champions League. And by the way, when you did get in the Champions League last season, you nearly exited in the group stage in a group you should have handled and finished first comfortably. Now, they got to the round of 16. That's all that matters. Maybe they go on a run. And I was the first person to go to bat for Antonio Conte. I whiffed on this one too. I thought Manchester United should have hired him because he would have done what Aaron Ten Hag has. And I also thought it would have worked at Spurs because this is another one of those situations where you have to change the culture. You have to change the identity, the narrative surrounding the club. He's the kind of person with the force of personality who can do it. And it hasn't happened. So that leads me to what I'm going to throw out here, which is, especially if they don't qualify for the Champions League this season. I don't think they're going to do this, but the right answer is sell Harry Kane. Because if you can't get into the top four, that means you have too many holes that you need to plug on in your squad. You cannot just go make another marquee signing next summer at whatever position, another attacker, another midfielder, I don't really care, and expect things are going to be different. So you got to try and kind of do what Liverpool did, which was sacrifice Philippe Coutinho. Now, I have confidence Harry Kane, if he gets sold, is going to work out much better for the team that acquires him than Philippe Coutinho did for Barcelona. But you turn that money into what you needed to fill out that squad to make them a team that can win a Champions League. You're not even trying to get that far if you're Spurs. But can you keep subjecting Harry Kane to this? Maybe making the Champions League. Again, if you make the Champions League, maybe it's a different conversation. But if they fail to qualify for the Champions League, again, I don't think they'll do it, but to me, that's the right answer. As that you say, look, Harry, you deserve better. We got to find a way to try and hang with a resurgent Manchester United, a Newcastle who's here to stay, a Liverpool who's going to continue to regroup and invest, Manchester City, Arsenal. Right, what we have right now isn't good enough. Then my other question to that is, okay, if you hypothetically decide to sell Harry Kane, the only team that comes to mind for me is Real Madrid. Is Real Madrid ready to invest in a Harry Kane when Kylian Mbappe is potentially sitting there and Karim Benzema is still playing really well? Right? It's not like Harry Kane is kind of your long-term, slow transition into that's our next number 9. If you're buying Harry Kane, you're buying him to play him. But the other team is Manchester City, and that team, there's no spot for him on that club anymore. Which goes to my larger point of something has to change, and unless Harry Kane is sold, I just don't see what that is. And I've tricked myself one too many times into believing Spurs are going to be better than they are, and this is just the reality of the situation until something actually changes. I got to that point with Manchester United, and now I do believe something has changed. Waiting for the same thing for Spurs. Speaking of Manchester United, they are up next. I talked about this after the Manchester Derby on the weekend roundup. I'm all in. I'm all in on Erik ten Hag. I don't really care that they drew against Crystal Palace earlier today. That was a really unfortunate way to concede an equalizer. Just excellent from Michael Olise. Sometimes it happens. This is why you can't be so bad in the first half of the season and expect to be in a title race. They had to do what they did just to actually get within striking distance of Arsenal and to catch Manchester City. Now you have to repeat that to keep pace with them for the second half of the season. It was possible that they could, or that Arsenal kind of fall back to the pack and Manchester City never get it going, which is why I still hold the belief that if you're going to consider Manchester City a title contender, and maybe I'm starting to, depending on how the weekend goes in that game against Arsenal, maybe that's the end of Manchester United as a title contender. But coming out of the Manchester Derby, if you were considering City, if you thought this race was still open and you weren't 100% convinced Arsenal were going to win, then Manchester United and Manchester City were both title contenders. Again, kind of like my Liverpool point, let's just, right? Step one is just getting back into the Champions League and stop doing all of the things that have made Manchester United a punching bag for the past 5 or so seasons. Things like consistently beating the teams you're supposed to in the middle and bottom of the table, which they've done this season outside of the beginning where it was kind of all, it looked like it was going to repeat itself again until they finally got everything sorted out. And not having these massive ups and downs that go from Ole Gunnar Solskjaer's everything for Manchester United to Ole out, Ole back at the wheel, Ole out, all that stuff. How about just some consistency? That's what you've gotten this season. The other part of this is just look at the actual squad. Is it really shocking that they've been significantly better with Casemiro and Christian Eriksen playing as your holding midfielders as opposed to Fred and Scott McTominay? And that a center back combination of Lisandro Martinez and Rafael Varane are performing much better than whatever combinations were being thrown out there the past few seasons before they overhauled the center back position. This isn't that complicated. And then, of course, you got Marcus Rashford playing out of his mind. They're just better, and they have a better manager who knows how to get the best out of this team and who has actually gotten this team to believe in themselves again and has done the really hard part, the part I wasn't sure he could do, which is to change the culture. This is 100% sustainable. Now, are they in a position to challenge for a league title next season? Maybe not. It might take a couple years. But all of a sudden, this becomes a much more attractive destination and puts Manchester United back into the conversation for the players that, when you're floating around the Europa League, as prominent as Manchester United is, you're not going to be able to get, the very, 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 very best. This puts them back into that conversation. It puts them back where they belong in terms of some of the most powerful from a what they offer on the field standpoint. Of course, economically, of course, reputation-wise, they're as big as any club in the world. But they lost the gravitas on the field, and that is what is returning under Erik ten Hag. The other thing I would like to say here, I know the Wout Weghorst signing is kind of getting laughed at, and everybody's talking about how he didn't perform well at Burnley, and that is true. It's also true Wout Weghorst scored a goal every 2 games he played in the Bundesliga. Go look at his numbers. They're quite good. Does that mean he's going to be a massive success at Manchester United? No. He also wasn't brought in to be a massive success. He's not the long-term solution at the position, and Marcus Rashford is going to get every opportunity. Now, of course, they could also play together, which is what you saw in the Crystal Palace game. I also liked what I saw from Weghorst in terms of him dropping deep and kind of initiating attacks for a Marcus Rashford who's comfortable coming in the middle, an Antony who likes to cut inside, a Bruno Fernandes who has no problem playing as kind of a false 9. I think this can work. And I also just don't think, if you're relying on Wout Weghorst to carry your goal-scoring load, that's a problem. But that's not what this is. I'm much higher on the signing than most people. And if nothing else, I just want to defend Wout Weghorst because the dude put up numbers in the Bundesliga. If you don't believe me, go look him up for yourself. Next, Manchester City. Very interesting time to talk about City with everything that's kind of gone on. I would first like to say it is not possible for Erling Haaland to simultaneously be a unstoppable human force and the problem to Manchester City's attack. It's one, the other, or neither. It cannot be both. Every time it's good or bad, we change collectively, we change the narrative about this guy. And I'm really sick of it. He is brilliant. He is also not set up to play at his very best to maximize his potential because of City's system, and that was always going to be the reality of the situation. He's doing just fine. It's also going to take guys a while to actually adjust to him and for Pep to figure out how to maximize this. There's also the reality that the way they play, and I don't think this gets talked about enough, always puts them at risk because they are so, and only comes up in the Champions League, really. They're so reliant on control, right? Control of possession, control of the tempo of the game, that if one thing goes wrong, it has a tendency to snowball, and if one thing goes wrong, they're not good at improvising, because that's not what they do. They can't thrive in chaos like Liverpool can, or, has over this period of time. And so, and this sport is kind of a great equalizer in that sense, right? Of course, they win a ridiculous amount of games. But on any given day, if things don't go quite right, Southampton can beat them. It's when 2 or 3 plays can decide a game in favor of one team or another, no matter how talented you are and how much better you are player for player than the other team. It's a lot easier to hang in there, holding on for dear life defensively, than it is to try and, score with the Kevin Durant, Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, Draymond Green Warriors for an entire game. It's what makes this sport fun for me, part of it. The other thing is, Erling Haaland's not the one who's being sloppy in possession. To me, that's the biggest takeaway from these last couple games. They just don't look like Manchester City. And maybe some of it is being tired, and I also will continue to say I don't think enough attention gets paid to this idea of trying to repeat as champions, which City have done a pretty good job of being able to go again. And now you've got some of these guys who have, 2, 3, 4 Premier League titles. You're just never going to convince me the motivation level is the same for this Manchester City team outside of Haaland, basically, as it is for that Arsenal team that's been nowhere close to this before. That's not a criticism of Manchester City's professionalism. That's not a shot at their players. To me, it's just how humans are wired. it's just there's an extra level of motivation you can draw from when you are trying to do something for the first time, when you lost in the championship the season before, stuff like that. That as much as you want to, and it's kind of what made Michael Jordan great, right? That he somehow found a way to draw from that motivation that shouldn't be available to him, but he found a way. There just aren't many humans wired like that can do that. And so there is a level of complacency that steps in as much as you want to fight against it. And now this is officially on pace, as of now, to be their worst season in this stretch. Kind of since Pep has turned them into what they are, since outside of that 2019-20 season. It is still entirely possible they finish with a point total that is in the ballpark of what they have outside of those 2 seasons where they were ridiculously, historically great. And that's the point I keep coming to. This isn't as out of the ordinary as we're making it seem. We're just comparing Manchester City to the Manchester City teams that were among the best in the history of the league and, scored 100 goals and collected 100 points. And they don't do that every season. There was a small stretch where that's who they were. And they weren't the past 3-4 seasons, that's not who they've been. They have taken a slight step back because it's awfully difficult to continue to get 100 points in this league. The final thing I want to say, over the past couple seasons, Ferran Torres, Raheem Sterling, Gabriel Jesus, Alexander Zinchenko have left. Also Fernandinho. Impact on the field, not so much. Leadership, experience, understanding how to navigate a Premier League season, he brings value there. So I'm throwing him into that mix too. And your key players who have come in, Jack Grealish, Julian Alvarez, Calvin Phillips. Grealish sometimes starts, sometimes doesn't. Hasn't ever really got going at City. Alvarez is playing more for Argentina than City at this point because he's behind Haaland. Not a criticism of him. He's a very good player, and he's going to have a very bright future. My point is he wasn't supposed to be a guy that's going to help you immediately anyway. I would argue he's been better outside of even what he did at the World Cup than he was expected to be right when he got to City. And Calvin Phillips has been injured and mostly sits on the bench. That's where the money has gone these past couple seasons. And all of those other guys who, varying, levels of contribution, but all those guys were allowed to walk. You didn't see much of that in the years before. Leroy Sané is the one guy that comes to mind. Of course, there is some change here, some change there. But those guys, Raheem Sterling played a prominent role, but the other guys were part of this machine and understood exactly how Pep wants it to work. And this new group, it hasn't been a particularly smooth transition. So I wanted to bring that up too, because I think it's part of the story. They just haven't, it's not a talent decrease, but they just don't have quite as many guys from a look at what they've done for Manchester City and how Pep has molded them into the player he wants them to be sitting on their bench anymore. Because the guys he's brought in the past couple of seasons haven't really gotten acclimated yet. And maybe over time they do. I'm the biggest Calvin Phillips fan you'll find. But for this season and looking at what has sort of gone wrong and why they are where they are, that's part of the story for me. And then finally, we get to Arsenal. The consistency has been extraordinary. I talked about it at the beginning of this season. I think I've brought this up since then as well. What did Arsenal in last season in terms of the fight for the Champions League was it was never just one loss. It was two. It was three. It was horrible stretches. It was never just we lost a game and we moved on. And what have they done every single time, the few times they've faced adversity this season? moved on, got right back to winning. It's a testament to this team. It's a testament to Arteta. It's one of the reasons I am so confident in them at this point. This is their league to lose. End of story. There's a difference between that and being champions-elect, where the title race is over. Too many games left. I don't care who it is. Too many games left. But this is a title chase, not a title race. They have earned that much respect, and they have that. The gap at the top speaks for itself. My one concern here is, and it's not a major one, but it's what I want to bring up in terms of the conversation that now needs to be had, is what could go wrong. Pretty soon here, they're going to have to start caring a little bit more about the Europa League. Because you're not in the Europa League group stage anymore. And while I fully expect they're going to keep their focus on the Premier League, I also don't expect to see the same kind of lineups we saw where, Eddie Nketiah was carrying the goal-scoring load. And that's not a shot at Eddie Nketiah, just the idea of there was very much a B squad put out there because their B squad did just fine getting through the group stage of the Europa League, as you would expect. The depth of this team is one of the things that doesn't get talked about enough. You go top to bottom, my one concern was Gabriel Jesus, but Eddie Nketiah said, I got this. When called upon, he's been very good. He doesn't have to score a million goals because Gabriel Jesus wasn't scoring a million goals. He's just got to take some of the chances and score enough and be enough of, just get involved in the game. And he's doing that just fine. But you look at everywhere else, and they've got multiple players you trust for the most part. So they can absolutely navigate the Europa League and the Premier League while using a little bit tighter of a squad. But it is something to consider that, for the most part, that starting 11 just kind of got the day off or came in for 30 minutes if they needed at the end of a Champions League or the end of a Europa League game. I don't expect that to be the case once you get to the knockout stage here. But it should be fine. I just wanted to bring that up as things that could possibly go wrong. I'll save more of my sort of overall thoughts on Arsenal until the end of the season. But the other thing I do want to say here is this is not some kind of fortuitous series of events that has led Arsenal to being atop the Premier League. Part of the Leicester City story in 15-16 was everybody else was bad. There was a massive opening, and somehow, some way, that Leicester team found a way to incredibly walk through it and take advantage. That's the part they deserve credit for, is somebody had to actually do it. And nobody in the world thought it would be them, but they found a way. And by the way, they won that comfortably. It's not like it went down to the final day. They were clearly the best team in the league. You will never see me trying to denigrate what that Leicester team did. The point being, everybody else was kind of at a low point, or in some kind of rebuild, some kind of restructuring. That's not the case with this. This is Arsenal putting up or at least being on pace to put up one of the higher point totals in Premier League history. This is still Manchester City being very, very good. That Liverpool team, I know they're not playing well this season and have dealt with some stuff. That's still a team that's around. Look at what Manchester United are doing. This lead was in no way, shape, or form handed to Arsenal because everybody else has been bad. Now, do you also need Manchester City to slip up a couple times more than expected to have this kind of lead at this point in the season? Sure. But Arsenal are there because Arsenal just aren't dropping points. So that's where I want to end this. This is this is 100% what Arsenal are doing, not everybody else's shortcomings. Go look at what Arsenal are on pace to get points wise. Go look at the other Premier League champions in the past 10 or so seasons. And my new favorite stat about this, I looked at it when I did my written piece on Arsenal on my Substack, touchlinetalk.substack.com. That came out last week, and it'll be even more true now because Arsenal won again. This team is on pace for more points than the Invincibles. That's how good they've been. So don't lose sight of that part of this story, too. It's not just some happy underdog Cinderella unexpected champion. This is a phenomenal team, and what they're doing is incredible. That is the state of the Premier League Big Six. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, I'll look at the rest of Europe's top 5 leagues as we kind of get ready for the second half of the season, what I'm keeping my eye on, and kind of some thoughts on what's happened so far. You're watching the Touchline Talk Show. Don't go anywhere. And welcome back to the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to hit that subscribe button. Okay, second segment here dedicated to the other 4 of Europe, the top 5 leagues in Europe. So much focus on the Premier League. I wanted to kind of take some time to look at what's happening with everything else, especially with the Bundesliga coming back finally this weekend. So we're going to go in alphabetical order of the countries. So starting in France. How the top of the table looks right now: PSG first on 47 points, Lens 44, Marseille 42, Monaco, Rennes 37. Those are kind of your teams in the Champions League conversation. By the way, PSG have lost to Lens and Rennes in their last 3 league games. It has not gone particularly well since coming back from the World Cup. Lens have the best defense in the league. They're also the only team in the league without multiple losses. Yeah, not PSG. That's Lens. And Marseille have been in really, really good form and now don't have a European competition to focus on, to sort of have to spread their resources because, well, they finished 4th in the Champions League group again. This is still very, I'm not going to sit here and say PSG are in any kind of real danger. They are winning the league by 3 points. I expect they win it by more than that. But there was a long stretch here where PSG were undefeated across all competitions. And Lens in particular were able to just kind of hang in there by not losing games. They've got some draws, which is why they're 3 points back. But this, to me, it's not as much about PSG as it is the rest of these teams in this league are really hanging in there. And then PSG lose 2 out of 3. Lens get a head-to-head win. And now all of a sudden it's a 3-point gap. But this is kind of setting up to be really interesting. Of course, Lens kind of coming out of nowhere. They've been decent the past few seasons since getting promoted. This was not supposed to be, former Chicago Fire player Przemysław Frankowski is out there scoring penalties for him. It's a great story that, because there are so many other great stories with Arsenal, with Napoli, it's kind of flying under the radar, I think. So I want to give them a shout out. And then this Marseille team, too. Think about where they were not so long ago. Get back into the Champions League and are backing it up in domestic competition as well. Because so many times you see that team get into the European competition. Think Burnley in the Europa League. Think West Ham last season. And it kind of, and now what is happening to West Ham this season, and it really takes a toll if you're not ready for it and you don't have, PSG money to go build a team with 20 plus starters on it. Having those extra games, that extra competition that obviously you care a great deal about because it's a European one, really takes a toll. And Marseille have found a way to balance it, and now they don't have to worry about it for the rest of the season. And it's been a little bit more up and down for Monaco and Rennes, but they're also right there, at least in the conversation. So that is kind of what is going on in France. Then we get to Germany. Like I said, the Bundesliga is about to resume. They took the traditional Bundesliga winter break after the World Cup. So you've got teams playing friendlies. You've got Daley Blind signing for Bayern Munich. And we haven't seen any of these teams playing a competitive game since, early November. Current table, Bayern 34 points, Freiburg 30, Leipzig 28, Frankfurt 27, Union Berlin 27, Dortmund 25. There's a lot of teams kind of up at the top of this league. It was Union Berlin who was really keeping pace with Bayern. They've sort of fallen off. Freiburg have been incredibly consistent across both the Europa League and the Bundesliga. Very quietly having an excellent season. Want to give them a shout out too. The other teams has been a little bit more up and down. And Dortmund just can't seem to get it going. There was a stretch where I was really, especially when Bayern were struggling too, I was talking myself into the fact that Dortmund were keeping themselves in there, keeping themselves in the title race. And they just didn't do quite enough to ever actually overtake Bayern. And then you slip up, Bayern starts winning 5, 6, 7 in a row, and all of a sudden it's kind of over if you're Dortmund. But they also need to get back into the Champions League. That's going to be part of this story here, is can they put a run together in the second half of the season? Can Sebastian Haller make an impact? We'll see what kind of fitness level he's at. The other couple things I want to mention here. Manuel Neuer out for the season. I don't think it's official yet. At least I haven't seen anything, but there were plenty of reports I saw that Jan Sommer is going to come in and be his replacement. The fact Bayern can just do that is an incredible luxury as sort of a short-term option there. Bayern know as well as anybody in the world just how good Jan Sommer can be with what he's done to them in his career. So there is a goalkeeping situation to keep an eye on at Bayern. And then Leipzig. Marco Rose has Leipzig rolling. It's been, it was bad, and then it got awful, and then they pulled their Champions League, group stage together, and they started winning big time in the Bundesliga. And now all of a sudden, your first game back is against Bayern Munich. They win that, it's 3 points. You ask me if Bayern's going to get pushed by somebody, who is it? Without a doubt in my mind, it's Leipzig. Can they keep this going? What do they look like coming out of this extended layoff? Because they were easily the most informed team in this league heading into it. We'll have to see. But they're doing that thing again where it's just incredible highs, incredible lows. And I thought that they were going to have it going at the beginning of the season, and it did not go that way at all. But now Timo Werner's back. Christopher Nkunku is the leading scorer in this league. And here they are back in a Champions League spot, still within striking distance if they can keep this up in the second half of the season. But Bayern doing Bayern things despite how shaky they've been at times this season. That's the other story out of this for me, is this is the kind of season that Dortmund needed to be able to take advantage of. In terms of the formula for Dortmund winning this league, Bayern are doing their part by dropping all these points, and Dortmund just have not been able to take advantage of that the way that they need to in order to dethrone Bayern. It's not like Bayern have been great, but they have started to turn things around a little bit, and even bad Bayern has been better than everybody else. On to Italy, where, of course, the story is Napoli. I talked about this on the weekend roundup. I'm not going to spend all that much time on it again. They are so clearly better than everybody else. They just put 5 goals past the Juventus team that doesn't give up any goals. I don't know how long they can keep this group together, but the incredible part is that this group was basically built this summer. I mean, of course there were players who have been there Victor Osimhen didn't come in this summer, but some of these other pieces that have just filled in perfectly, I mean, they are a real treat to watch. I I sincerely hope they win this league. Just it would be such a sort of a pure throwback kind of thing because they deserve it. They've they've done a great job of just sort of hanging in there and always being relevant with this great, the Insignia, Dries Mertens, these guys who just have always stayed, and now those guys are gone, and look what they're doing. It's absolutely incredible, and they've been every bit as good in the Champions League too. That's the one thing that's also interesting about this to me is they. I've had them sitting at 2 in my top 25 for a while now, and well, them going back and forth with Manchester City. But I think there's clearly 3 teams, and then there's everybody else. It's Arsenal, it's Napoli, and it's Manchester City. Everybody else has had some really rough patches through the season, or real questions if they can win a Champions League if you're PSG, who are also in the midst of a little rough patches I already laid out. They can win the Champions League too. They're that good. Can they sort of navigate all of that? But the other thing is, again, I know they just got knocked out of the Coppa Italia in kind of embarrassing fashion. I also don't care one bit because that was a completely rotated team because they got bigger things to deal with and more important things to worry about. So, but, they do have an incredible amount of depth where it's not one, some of these pieces have been in and out. It's not like Victor Osimhen has played every single game and they've been just fine. Can they keep this up? To me, it's not a question of if they win the league. It's a question of can they continue to be this much better than everybody else, or do they slow down a little bit as the season goes on? Other couple things I want to mention. The second best goal difference in this league is Lazio. Oh, so sorry, I forgot to do our table here. So Napoli have 47 points, AC Milan have 38, Juventus and Inter have 37, Lazio have 34, Atalanta have 34, Roma have 34. Second best goal difference, though, is Lazio. That's in large part because the Milan clubs and Atalanta had it going defensively for a while, which is why they were hanging with Napoli, and then it kind of fell apart, which is why they're no longer hanging with Napoli. They're conceding too many goals. They got defensive issues. Roma and Juventus aren't scoring enough goals. And so you just don't have another team that's balanced the way Napoli is and as dynamic offensively as Napoli is. And so everybody else kind of has these flaws. And we finally got to where I expect, outside of Napoli. Nobody saw Napoli coming. I'm not going to pretend like I did. If anything, I expected them to struggle this season because of what they lost. So got that one really wrong too. But there just wasn't a lot separating the rest of these teams for me, and that's exactly where we're at. Particularly the Milan clubs and Juventus. I expected Juventus to be better. Now that's finally starting to look like a good prediction. Of course, they were also awful for a while there. Inter had a stretch where they couldn't beat anybody good. AC Milan have been fine, but just never really kicked it into high gear. And again, they lost, the pressure of trying to repeat. They don't have the exact same squad from last season. They didn't really reinforce in a lot of meaningful ways. And so it was kind of logical they were going to take a little bit of a step back. Inter are just kind of hanging around. And maybe this is a different conversation if Lukaku had been healthy all season. That's another interesting storyline to follow second half. And, of course, what Juventus sort of do in part 3 after the awful beginning, the excellent recovery, and now you're just sort of back at square one. Who takes control of those couple Champions League spots, who wins the battle of these 3 teams in the second half of the season. And then Spain, Barcelona 41 points, Real Madrid 38, Real Sociedad 35, Atletico Madrid, Villarreal, Real Betis all on 28. Of course, Betis have an extra game to play because they played in the Spanish Super Cup that kind of messed everybody's schedules up. So they are much more in this conversation than their current place in the table suggests. And then there are also 3 other clubs, Osasuna, Athletic, and Rayo Vallecano, with 26 or 27 points. So the race for the Champions League spots, the race for the other European spots, should be really, really exciting in La Liga, which is always a great thing for the league. Real Sociedad have been really, really impressive. and have basically been as impressive as Atletico Madrid have been disappointing. It wasn't just the Champions League for Atleti. It's not like it's been going great in La Liga either. Now João Felix is gone. It just kind of seems like this is the end of this Atletico Madrid, and it's time to reboot and rebuild. We'll see if that actually happens. But Sociedad, across the Europa League, across La Liga, have been phenomenal. And I'm also a big fan of this Betis team. And you've got a Villarreal team there that proved what they can do last season. So there's an awful lot of pressure in terms of that Champions League spot, that in the fourth one in particular. If you're Sociedad, you got to keep it up because there are people who are going to keep putting pressure on you. Now, they've got a pretty good cushion right now, but stranger things have happened. And then you've got all these teams, if you're Atletico Madrid, who are right there. I'm not convinced in any way, shape, or form Atletico Madrid are going to be the Champions League next season. So that's a storyline to follow is, kind of what becomes of this. How does this season end for Atleti, and what are the ramifications of that heading into next season? The other thing I want to mention here, I've been harping on this, that this title race is not as close as the actual points totals suggest, and Barcelona have been much better than Real Madrid. 538's Soccer Power Index gives Barcelona a 69% chance when I looked earlier today of winning this league. To put that in perspective, Arsenal is at 55%. I would have Arsenal at more like 60, 65. I'm more confident in Arsenal than 538 are. But I think around the 70% mark is spot on for Barcelona. I know it's only a 3-point gap. I just have more faith in Barcelona with what they've done this season, especially in La Liga. I know the Champions League was a disaster, but week in, week out, they have just been better than Real Madrid. And I also think I brought this up at least once. Their most challenging game, second half of the season, all at home. They already played Sociedad on the road. They already played Real Madrid on the road. These teams that have to make up ground have to come to the new camp. I'll take Barcelona. With that being the situation, with the way they're playing, I feel very confident in this as well. I'm not sure that we're going to get any of the 5 leagues, a really exciting title race. It's certainly possible. Maybe Bayern never really kind of kick it into high gear and somebody hangs around in Germany. Maybe Napoli fall back to the pack. I think our best bet is probably Spain, because I don't think Barcelona winning by 8 points or something like that. I think it's going to be more like they win on the second to last game of the season to clinch it, or they win by 3 points because they win on the last day where 400 things would have to go right for Real Madrid to catch them or something like that. And certainly not convinced the Premier League is going to be a runaway for Arsenal. But I don't see a title race right now where I'm convinced that one's going down to the wire. That's going to be captivating from game 1 to game 38. Because I do think it's very clear at this point who the best team in all 5 leagues are. And we don't always get to say that, for better or for worse. But that is where we are at. I'm going to take one more quick break, and then going to end the show as we always do with the weekend look ahead. You're watching the Touchline Talk Show. Don't go anywhere. And welcome back one final time to the Touchline Talk Show. It is time for the weekend look ahead. Got all 5 leagues to talk about for the first time in a long time because the Bundesliga, as I mentioned before, is finally back. Starting in England, as always, Tottenham at Manchester City on Thursday. If City are going to stay in this title race, they got to win this game at home. Tottenham could, have struggled against Big Six opposition, have also given Manchester City in particular some trouble. This is a massive game for both teams. Really, really intrigued by that one. And then you get to the weekend. Chelsea at Liverpool, as I mentioned earlier. Didn't expect that to be a mid-table clash, but here we are. Everton at West Ham. Another massive game in the relegation battle. West Ham at home against what is possibly the worst team in the league. That has to be 3 points. On the flip side, Everton just lost at home to Southampton after having a lead. There are only so many, and this is not exactly what I'd be pointing to in terms of this is where you can get your points. But this is another relegation candidate, as hard as that is to believe for me with West Ham. You're only getting so many of these opportunities if you're Everton. And then Sunday, Wolves at Manchester City, Manchester United at Arsenal. I mentioned the City game because of the title race and Wolves also struggling in the relegation battle. That's a game City should win. You never know with Wolves, though. They're one of those tricky teams that sometimes strange things happen and Adama Traore turns into a world-class player for 60 minutes. It happens. And, of course, the big one, Manchester United at Arsenal. This would have carried even more weight had United won that midweek game against Crystal Palace. It's still about the top four for United. It's still trying to close that gap to Arsenal and seeing if they can stay in this title race. And, of course, Arsenal, it's two things. One, can you just stop people from gaining ground on you in the head-to-head matchups because they do still have City twice. And the other thing is they don't lose at home. If they can keep that up, they're in really, really, really good position. Because, right, they lost a game in which they were good at Old Trafford. You win this one, you kind of remove Manchester United from the equation. And if you can hold serve at home against Manchester City, you're getting to a place where if you just do your job, you're removing them from the conversation too. That is going to be one of the stories of the second half of the Premier League season is just Arsenal take care of business at home. Because you're going to have a hard time catching them if you can't take at least if you're City, get 4 points from those two games instead of 3 and leave Arsenal with 1 or something. If Arsenal win these 2 home games against the Manchester clubs, good luck trying to catch them. In Spain, Getafe at Barcelona, Real Madrid at Athletic Club. Athletic Club, I mentioned, one of those teams in that European race in that kind of jumbled mess outside of the top 3 teams. So difficult game there. Barcelona at home should take care of business. A couple suspensions to deal with, though, so we'll see what happens there. Italy, Napoli go to Salernitana, Calcio, and had to try and make sure I pronounced that right. And then Atalanta travel to Juventus on the Napoli Salernitana Calcio game is Saturday. Atalanta Juventus on Sunday. That's the other game I want to highlight. Atalanta trying to get back into that top 4 conversation. Juventus, what do you do after Napoli just humiliated you? Germany, finally back, as I mentioned before. Bayern Munich at Red Bull Leipzig to start us off on Friday. Freiburg at Wolfsburg on Saturday. That's your most interesting game in terms of teams at the top of the table. And then Bayer Leverkusen at Borussia Mönchengladbach on Sunday. That's also kind of one of your, 2 of your higher profile teams in Germany, trying to look at some of the best matchups as that league comes back. And then France, all kinds of Coupe de France round of 16 action. I'm not going to go through all of them. There aren't particularly high profile matchups, but of course you're always got the potential for an upset. So we'll see what happens there. That is all for this week's edition of the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to hit that subscribe button.